Some men don't need to raise their voice to change your life. I remember the first time I saw the bruise on Emily Carter's wrist. It was a Thursday night, just past 9, the neon beer sign buzzing above the bar, and the smell of black coffee hanging in the air, and she moved like she always did, steady, quiet, balancing 3 plates like the world wasn't heavy. But when she reached across my table to set down my glass of bourbon, her sleeve slipped back half an inch, and there it was, a dark shadow against pale skin, shaped like fingers that had held on too tight. She pulled the fabric down fast, offered that practice smile, the one meant to keep tips coming and questions away, and said, "Refill." Like nothing in her world was out of place, but I've built an empire on noticing what other people miss, the tremor in her breath, the way her eyes avoided the front door every time it opened, the way she checked her phone and turned it face down without reading the screen. I didn't ask her who did it. Not yet, because power isn't loud, it listens. And I listened to the silence between her words, to the story she wasn't telling. And when the door finally swung open and a man stepped inside with impatience written all over his face, I didn't need an introduction to know he was connected to that bruise. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. Control showed in smaller ways, in how she straightened too quickly, in how her shoulders tightened when he stood too close, in how her laugh lost its warmth the second he looked at her. I watched from my booth, the city's noise muted behind the glass, rain streaking down the window in thin silver lines, and I felt something I don't usually allow myself to feel. Not anger, not yet, but recognition, because I know what it looks like when someone believes they have no exit, when they measure their life in careful steps and lowered voices. She carried his check outside, into the cold air, and through the reflection in the window, I saw him grab her wrist again, not violently, just firm enough to remind her who he thought she belonged to. And that was the moment something in me shifted, quiet but absolute. I didn't stand up. I didn't make a scene. I simply reached for my phone and stepped away from the noise of the diner into the hallway where the light flickered overhead. And when my call connected, I spoke the same way I always do, calm, measured, final, because in this city, solutions travel faster than rumors. And sometimes the most merciful thing a powerful man can do is remove a problem without anyone ever knowing how close it came to breaking someone. When I walked back to my table, Emily was inside again, smoothing her apron, pretending everything was fine, and she looked at me for half a second longer than usual, like she sensed the air had changed, like something unseen had just tilted in her favor, and I held her gaze without promising anything out loud, because she didn't need promises. She needed peace, and I had already decided she would have it. The rain stopped around midnight, leaving the pavement outside the diner slick and shining under the streetlights, and I stayed longer than usual, long after the last customer paid their bill and the chairs were flipped upside down on the tables, because I wanted to see if she would walk out alone. Emily moved slower than she had earlier, wiping down the counter in small circles, her mind somewhere else. And when she finally untied her apron and reached for her coat, she hesitated for just a second before checking her phone again, the screen lighting up her face in a pale glow. No smile this time, just a quiet exhale like she had been bracing for something that did not arrive. I stepped outside first, the air cool against my skin, the city humming in the distance, and I watched from across the street as she pushed the door open and looked both ways, expecting headlights that never came. Sometimes absence is louder than presence. And tonight the silence around her felt deliberate. She wrapped her coat tighter, walked toward the bus stop at the corner, heels tapping softly against concrete, and I noticed the way her shoulders were not pulled up to her ears anymore, not rigid, not waiting for a voice to call her back. She still carried caution, but it was different now, lighter by a few pounds. My phone vibrated once in my pocket, a single message confirming that arrangements had been handled, nothing dramatic. Nothing that would make the evening news, just a quiet resolution that would encourage a certain man to reconsider his choices and perhaps relocate his attention far from this neighborhood. I did not respond, because the work had already been done the moment I decided it would be. Across the street, a city bus pulled up with a sigh of brakes, doors folding open, and Emily stepped inside, dropping a few crumpled bills into the fare box, choosing a seat by the window. For a brief second our eyes met through the glass, and I wondered if she sensed the shift in the air, if she felt that something pressing against her life had eased. I am not a hero, and I do not pretend to be one, but I understand leverage, and I understand timing. And sometimes protection does not look like standing in front of someone. Sometimes it looks like removing what stands behind them. The bus pulled away, red lights fading down the avenue, and I remained on the sidewalk until it disappeared from view, the night settling back into its usual rhythm. Tomorrow she would wake up and notice her phone was quiet, that no one was demanding to know where she was, that no one was waiting outside her shift, and she would not know why, at least not yet. But I would be there again, sitting in the same booth, ordering the same bourbon, watching the door open, not to control her world, not to claim it, but to make sure it stayed wide enough for her to walk through without fear. The next evening she walked into the diner 10 minutes early, and that was the first sign something had changed, because people who live under pressure are rarely early. They are careful, they are delayed, they are always reacting. But Emily Carter moved with a quiet steadiness, her hair pulled back, her uniform pressed, and when she reached for a stack of menus the sleeve of her shirt slid back again. Only this time the bruise had faded from deep purple to a dull yellow, like a storm losing its strength. I was already in my booth, the same corner, the same glass of bourbon resting untouched in my hand. And when she noticed me, she did not flinch, she did not glance at the door behind me. She simply held my gaze for a heartbeat longer than usual, as if measuring something. The diner filled slowly, truck drivers, a couple on a late date, the low hum of a country song playing from the old speaker above the counter, and she moved between tables with more space in her shoulders, more air in her lungs. I have watched markets rise and fall, watched men bluff and break, and I know what relief looks like. It is subtle, almost shy. Halfway through her shift, she stopped at my table. Without her order pad, just her hands resting lightly against the edge, and she asked, "Has it always been this quiet on Thursdays?" And I understood that she was not asking about the diner. I let the question settle between us like steam from fresh coffee, and said, "Sometimes quiet means something heavy has moved on." And she studied my face, searching for arrogance, for confession, for any sign that I wanted credit. I offered none. Power does not need applause. She nodded slowly, as if confirming a suspicion she had carried since morning, and told me that someone who used to wait outside had not called, had not texted, had not shown up, and there was confusion in her voice, but not fear. Confusion can turn into freedom if given enough room. I watched her straighten a napkin dispenser that did not need straightening and realized that for the first time since I met her, she was not bracing for impact. Later, when her shift ended, she did not rush out the back door. She walked through the front, past my booth, and paused. "Thank you," she said softly, though I had not admitted to anything. Gratitude does not require details. I tilted my head slightly, not in ownership, not in control, but in acknowledgement, because this was never about claiming her life. It was about returning it. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, the night air cool and open around her, I saw it clearly. The shift that no one else would notice. The way she lifted her chin an inch higher, the way her steps carried intention instead of caution, and in that small adjustment I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not pride, not possession, but purpose. I could command men. I could influence outcomes. I could redraw maps of this city without leaving my seat. But watching her reclaim a few inches of peace was different. It was quieter, and somehow far more powerful. By the end of the week the diner felt different, not because the neon lights stopped flickering or the coffee tasted any better, but because Emily no longer checked the door every time it opened, and that absence had weight. I watched her from my usual booth, the glass of bourbon catching the amber glow of the overhead lamp, and for the first time since I noticed the mark on her wrist, she laughed without looking over her shoulder, a real laugh. Unguarded, the kind that belongs to someone who is not calculating consequences. Freedom does not arrive with fireworks. It slips in quietly, like dawn through half-closed blinds. She moved between tables with confidence now, shoulders back, steps measured, and when she reached me she did not rush away. She lingered. "You come here every night," she said, studying me as if I were the mystery instead of her, and I answered honestly. "I value consistency, because control has always been my language." She tilted her head slightly, eyes steady, and asked, "Do you always fix things that bother you?" And there it was, the question she had been circling since the silence began. I did not smile, Did not confirm, did not deny. I let the pause stretch, let her feel that I would never embarrass her with a confession she did not ask for. I prefer balance, I finally said, my voice low but even. When something is out of place, I correct it. She held my gaze, searching for threat, for dominance, for ownership, and found none. What she found, instead, was certainty. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, shaking the windows slightly. But she did not flinch. That small detail mattered more than any grand gesture. Fear used to live in her reflexes. Now it was fading from her muscle memory. She exhaled slowly, almost a release, and rested her fingertips against the back of the booth across from me, grounding herself in a world that felt suddenly wider. I do not know what happened, she said carefully, but I know something changed. And her voice did not tremble. I respected that. I respected her refusal to play the victim, her quiet decision to step forward instead of backward. Sometimes, I replied, change is just space being made. And the truth was that I had not removed a man for her sake alone. I had removed a shadow that did not deserve to linger. She studied me one more time, then nodded, not in submission, not in gratitude alone, but in understanding. There are moments when two lives intersect and neither demands control, only clarity. As she walked away to refill another table's coffee, I realized the power dynamic had shifted in a way I did not anticipate. I had adjusted her. Circumstances, yes, but she was adjusting me. In protecting her peace, I had stepped closer to something I do not often allow myself to feel. Not possession, not conquest, but responsibility. And for a man who commands rooms without standing up, that felt like the most dangerous shift of all. The following Monday, she did not just walk in early. She walked in different, like someone who had measured the distance between who she was and who she wanted to be and decided to close it. The morning light filtered through the wide front windows of the diner, soft and pale, catching the clean lines of her uniform, and there were no shadows left on her wrists, only faint traces that were already fading into memory. I arrived just after 8, the bell above the door giving its familiar chime. And when she saw me, she did not look surprised anymore. She looked prepared. "Good morning, Adrian," she said, using my name for the first time without hesitation, and there was something steady in her voice that had not been there before. Power is easy when people are afraid of you. It is far more complicated when they are not. I took my usual seat, but the ritual felt less like control and more like presence. She brought coffee instead of bourbon, setting it down with deliberate calm, and asked if I ever took a day off. I told her that men in my position do not often step away, and she replied, "Maybe that is the problem, not with defiance, but with quiet certainty." She was not challenging my authority, she was redefining it. I studied her face as she spoke about taking an extra class at the community college, about saving money, about moving to an apartment closer to downtown where the streetlights felt brighter and the sidewalks felt safer. She said these things as if they were already real, as if the version of her life that had once felt unreachable was now simply a matter of timing. I realized then that what I had done was not the end of something. It was the beginning. Removing fear creates space, but courage has to step into it. She was stepping. A customer at the counter complained about cold toast, and she handled it with patience. Not the brittle politeness of someone stretched thin, but the grounded tone of someone who knows she does not have to endure more than she chooses. I watched the way other men looked at her now, curious, respectful, unaware of the storm that had once circled her life, and I felt a shift inside myself that I could not command or calculate. She returned to my table once more before the lunch rush and leaned in slightly, not intimately, just enough to speak privately, and said, "Whatever balance you believe in, thank you for giving me room to breathe." And I understood that she did not need details, she needed direction. I met her eyes and said, "Make it count." Because protection without expectation is weakness, but protection that inspires growth is something else entirely. As I left the diner that morning, the sun higher now, warming the sidewalk in thin golden strips, I realized she no longer needed me in the way she had a week ago, and strangely, that did not diminish my power, it refined it. I had ruled through influence for years, but watching her choose her own path without fear felt like the first honest victory I had ever claimed. 2 weeks later, the diner no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like a crossroads, And I began to understand that Emily was not just rebuilding her life, she was redefining it. The evening crowd rolled in heavy with diesel jackets and quiet conversations, coffee cups clinking against saucers, and she moved through the narrow aisles with a confidence that did not ask permission. I noticed the way she carried herself now. Chin level, eyes direct, no scanning for exits, no measuring of moods. And when she approached my booth, she did not stand at a distance anymore. She slid into the seat across from me for the first time. That single decision carried more courage than most grand gestures. "I turned in my application today," she said, fingers wrapped around a ceramic mug, steam rising between us like something sacred. "Downtown leasing office, full-time, benefits, real hours." And there was a light in her expression that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with her. I listened, not as a man assessing risk, but as someone witnessing growth. She told me she had signed papers for a small studio apartment 6 blocks from the river for 100 square feet, 3rd floor, windows facing west so she could watch the sunset after work. And as she described it, I realized she was no longer speaking about escape. She was speaking about ownership. I asked if she was afraid of starting over, and she smiled softly, not naive, not reckless, just resolved. "I was more afraid of staying the same," she answered. That sentence settled into me deeper than any business negotiation ever had. Outside, traffic lights shifted from green to red, engines idled, life moving in predictable cycles. But inside that booth something irreversible had already happened. She was no longer the woman I had protected. She was becoming the woman who chose. I understood then that my influence had a boundary, and that boundary was her will. She did not owe me loyalty, or gratitude, or closeness. She owed herself a future. The realization did not weaken me, it sharpened me. Power without restraint is chaos, but power that steps back at the right moment becomes respect. She reached across the table briefly, not intimate, not dependent, just a quiet acknowledgement, her fingertips brushing mine for half a second, and said, "You gave me space, Adrian, but I am the one walking through it." And I nodded because that was exactly how it should be. I have commanded rooms full of men twice my size, negotiated deals worth more than this building will ever see. Yet nothing has required more discipline than allowing her to rise without attaching my shadow to her. Light. When she stood up to return to her shift, she did not look smaller without me. She looked taller on her own. And for the first time in years, I did not measure my strength by what I could control, but by what I could release. The day she handed in her 2 weeks' notice, the diner felt smaller than it ever had, like a chapter closing in slow motion, and I sat in my usual booth knowing the rhythm was about to change. Emily moved through the lunch crowd with calm precision, not clinging to the place that once sheltered her, not resenting it either, just honoring it for what it had been. When she reached my table, she did not carry a notepad, only a folded envelope in her hand. "I got the job," she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no question about whether she deserved it. I nodded once, steady, because celebration does not have to be loud to be real. She slid into the seat across from me again, sunlight cutting through the window and catching in her hair, and for a moment we simply sat there, two people who had altered each other's trajectory without ever naming the cost. "I move into the apartment on Saturday," she continued, describing the narrow staircase, the chipped paint on the railing, the way the west-facing window poured gold light across. "The hardwood floors around 6 in the evening. For 100 square feet," she said, but it felt like a kingdom because every inch belonged to her. I listened the way I always do, quietly, completely, understanding that this was not a report, it was a declaration. She was not asking permission, she was informing the man who had witnessed her turning point. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance then faded, the city breathing in and out, indifferent to personal revolutions. She studied me for a moment, searching for something deeper than approval. "You are not trying to stop me," she said, almost surprised. I shook my head slowly. Control would have been easy, influence even easier, but respect requires restraint. "You were never meant to stay," I told her, and the truth of that settled between us like a quiet promise. Her eyes softened, not with dependence, but with recognition. She understood that whatever this connection was, it did not cage her, it strengthened her. When her shift ended that afternoon, she did not change out of her uniform right away. She walked outside into the sunlight still wearing the name tag that read Emily, as if honoring the version of herself who survived long enough to evolve. I followed a few steps behind, not to escort, not to supervise, just to witness. She turned to face me on the sidewalk, traffic passing in steady waves, and said, "You gave me a chance to breathe, Adrian, but I chose to live." And there was no fear in her stance, only clarity. I held her gaze and realized that the most powerful thing I had done was not removing a threat. It was stepping back when she no longer needed shielding. As she walked away, shoulders squared, sunlight tracing her path down the block, I did not feel loss. I felt something rarer. I felt the city shift slightly under my feet, as if even it recognized that real power is not measured by who stays under your protection, but by who walks away stronger because of it. Saturday arrived with clear skies and a sharp breeze coming off the river, and I found myself standing across the street from a narrow brick building with 3 floors and a fire escape that had seen better years, watching Emily carry a single cardboard box up the steps. She had insisted she did not need help, and I respected that, but respect does not prevent observation. She moved carefully, balancing a lamp in one hand and a folded blanket under her arm, determination in every step. When she reached the 3rd floor landing, she paused to unlock the door, sunlight catching the edge of her hair, and for a second she looked back down at the street, as if confirming that no shadow followed her anymore. I did not wave. I did not call out. I simply remained there, hands in my coat pockets, understanding that this moment belonged to her. Later that evening my phone vibrated with a message, not from an associate, not from a business partner, but from her, an address, the same one I was already memorizing, followed by 3 words, "Sunset is unreal." I arrived just before 6, climbing the narrow staircase alone, hearing faint music from a radio somewhere below, and when she opened the door the apartment was exactly as she described, 400 square feet of possibility, hardwood floors reflecting amber light, a small couch pressed against the wall, and that west-facing window pouring gold across everything it touched. She stood barefoot on the floor, jeans cuffed at the ankles, no uniform, no name tag, just herself. "It is not much," she said softly. And I looked around at the chipped paint and the second-hand table and answered, "It is yours." She smiled at that, not because it impressed her, but because she understood what it meant. Ownership is not about size. It is about sovereignty. We stood by the window as the sun dipped lower, turning the river into a ribbon of fire, and she spoke about her first day at the new job on Monday, about learning new systems, meeting new people, stepping into rooms where no one knew her past. I listened, without offering strategy or protection, because she was no longer asking for either. She turned to me after a long silence and said, "You did not save me, Adrian. You reminded me I could save myself." And the honesty in her voice stripped away every layer of control I once relied on. I nodded slowly, accepting the correction. Power can open a door, but courage has to walk through it. As the last strip of sunlight faded from the floor, the room dimmed but did not darken. She reached over and switched on a small lamp, filling the space with a warm glow, and I realized that the light did not come from the window anymore. It came from her. And for the first time in a long time, I felt no need to command the night, because watching her stand steady in her own light was more than enough. Monday arrived with a sky the color of polished steel, and I did not go to the diner because there was no diner shift waiting for her anymore. Instead, I found myself parked across from a glass building downtown, 12 stories tall, sunlight reflecting off the windows like quiet ambition. At exactly 8:58 in the morning, Emily stepped through the revolving door wearing a navy blazer that fit her like a decision already made. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her posture straight, and there was no trace of hesitation in her stride. She did not scan the sidewalk. She did not brace for interruption. She walked as if the pavement belonged to her. I remained inside the car, engine off, watching the reflection of her figure disappear into the lobby. And for the first time since I noticed that first fading bruise weeks ago, I understood that my role in her story had shifted completely. I was no longer the shield, no longer the silent correction in the background. I was simply a witness to her ascent. My phone buzzed with routine matters, contracts, meetings, numbers that once defined my day. But none of them held the gravity of that single moment when she stepped into a future built by her own resolve. Around noon, a message arrived from her, brief and unfiltered. First day is overwhelming, but I am not afraid. And I read it twice. Not afraid. Those two words carried more weight than any declaration of loyalty ever could. I responded with a single sentence. You were never meant to be. And left it at that. Control would have tempted me to stay close, to ensure every variable aligned in her favor, but growth demands distance. That evening, as the city lights flickered on one by one, I stood by the river a few blocks from her apartment, hands resting on the cool metal railing, watching the current move steady and unstoppable. I thought about power, about how I once measured it in influence and outcomes, and how quickly a problem could be resolved. Now I measured it differently. I measured it in restraint, in the discipline of stepping back, in the strength it takes to let someone walk forward without attaching your shadow to their progress. When the sun dipped below the skyline and the windows of her new life glowed softly in the distance, I did not feel possessive. I did not feel distant. I felt aligned. She had reclaimed her peace, built her own foundation, and stepped into rooms without lowering her eyes. And I remained who I was, a man capable of moving cities in silence. But now aware that the greatest shift I ever witnessed did not happen in boardrooms or back alleys. It happened in a 400-square-foot apartment where a woman chose herself. He could influence the city, but she rewrote her destiny, and in doing so, she changed mine.